Hello, my name is Dustin Green, and today I'm going to be discussing mental health and crime. I'm choosing to discuss mental health issues and crime because I believe that there is a correlation between mental health issues and criminal behavior. My presentation will discuss mental health issues and how it is or is not addressed properly in our society. This presentation will discuss different behaviors that can stem from mental health issues. And finally, I will discuss solutions to mental health issues and why I think they need to be implemented as quickly as possible. So why are mental health issues relevant? According to Mental Health by the Numbers, 14.7% of Asians, 20.4% of whites, 16.2% of African Americans, and 16.9% of Hispanics were diagnosed with mental health illness in 2018. And this is important because some mental health issues can go undiagnosed and this can lead to crime. And it's also important to note that in 2018, these statistics are relevant for the people who were tested for mental health issues. But there are also people who were not tested for mental health issues. So these statistics may actually be higher than they appear to be in this slide. So the problem that I'm going to be addressing throughout my presentation is that people who break the law are more likely to go to jail or prison versus receiving a rehabilitation sentence. This is very problematic because you have war veterans who can return from Iraq, Afghanistan, and other countries who suffer from PTSD. And it's also important to know that PTSD is not limited to strictly war veterans. Post-traumatic stress disorder is defined as post-traumatic stress disorder is defined as a psychiatric disorder that can occur in people who have experienced or witnessed a traumatic event such as a natural disaster, a serious assault, a terrorist attack, war/combat, rape, or other violent personal assault. Now, this is very important because when some war veterans return from other countries, physically they'll be here in the United States, but mentally and cognitively, their minds can still be off in the country in which they were serving for the U.S. And their minds, while they were all serving at war, they could have been going through many violent experiences. And when they're back here in the United States, if they hear a loud bang, they hear a loud thud, they hear something that they heard while they were overseas, it can trigger flashbacks. And this can cause war veterans or someone else who has experienced a traumatic and violent experience in their life to rationally and physically act out against people that they love and care about, or just people in general. I have two examples of this. First, we have Lockhart. He was dishonorably discharged and he was suffering from an untreated post-traumatic stress disorder when he returned from the war in Iraq. His attorney argued that Lockhart was unable to adequately think and process information logically because of his illness. When Lockhart returned, he abducted, robbed, and fatally shot a college student named Lauren Burke in 2008. The second example is Herbert Richardson. Herbert Richardson was an African-American Vietnam War veteran who fought on the front lines until he was honorably discharged due to psychiatric illness that he developed from the service. He was executed in 1989 by the state of Alabama after being convicted of capital murder in 1978. Richardson's mental health problems were disregarded at his capital trial. Now, Herbert Richardson and Lockhart are not the only war veterans who suffer from PTSD. There are other people, and it can go undiagnosed, and people who have mental health illnesses can be charged for being sane and thinking logically, but when they committed the crime, their thinking was impaired and they couldn't rationalize things adequately. So what does previous literature teach about mental illness? Now again, another authors stated that lawmakers should actively consider policies grounded in rehabilitation while being slower to advocate for punitive reforms in response to public concerns over high-profile juvenile crimes. Now, what these authors are stating is that lawmakers should be more quick to create rehabilitation centers than create juvies for adolescents, because adolescents' brains are growing at a quick and rapid rate. And if they have a mental health issue that doesn't get treated early on, it can create problematic events for them down the line in their future. So what else does previous literature teach? Gingras stated that rehabilitation does work if it is applied correctly. The individual receiving rehabilitation will recover fully cognitively and physically. However, the amount of physiatrists that can adequately perform the rehabilitation is sparse in most countries. In Canada, there were only 45 physiatrists that practiced rehabilitation. So Gingras talks about the ratio in Canada, but what was the ratio in the United States? He stated that there was one rehabilitation worker per 25,000 people. So Gingras' main point is that when looking at ratios for rehabilitation workers and the general population, there is an undesirable amount. He states that there should be more rehabilitation workers to match the general population, because if there are many people with mental health illnesses and there are only so few rehabilitation workers, then not everyone can be treated adequately because there just aren't enough workers. So what else does previous literature teach? Well, Jeffries stated that many Americans have capitulated the idea of rehabilitation. Many Americans believe that rehabilitation does not work, or that it is quote-unquote too soft on criminals. Jeffrey stated that contemporary punishment is largely ineffective. Jeffrey believes that jail is ineffective, or largely ineffective, because it displays little positive effects on inmate self-esteem. When inmates are in jail or prison, they are often treated as garbage, and when they leave, they are believed that they are quote-unquote garbage. So Jeffrey stated that if someone is suffering from a mental health issue, and the point is to have that person recover, it's more beneficial to place them in a rehabilitation center while they'll have people to help them mentally and cognitively heal and raise their self-esteem, versus being placed in a jail where they are treated as quote-unquote garbage and their self-esteem is lowered, and their mental health issues do not get addressed as well. So what else does literature say? Well, Jeffries articulated that some people who are ordered by a judge to go to a rehabilitation system are unable to do so. People are often unable to enter rehabilitation locations because they are full. An example of this is when we look at Michael Reed. Jeffrey stated that Michael Reed suffered from seizures after being in a motorcycle accident. After committing the crime, a judge deemed Reed mentally ill and sentenced him to a psychiatric facility. However, since the only psychiatric hospital was overcrowded, he was placed in jail. I think this is pretty self-explanatory, but when a judge sentences someone to a rehabilitation center and they can't go, then their mental health does not get examined instantly, and their mental health issues can prolong. And if they committed a crime and they're unsafe, and they're viewed as unsafe to be reinstated into society, someone who suffered from a mental health illness can be placed in a jail instead of being placed in a rehabilitation center, even though they cognitively we're not aware of right and wrong in some situations. So, what else does previous literature teach? Pycroft illustrated that offering assistance to people with mental health issues is often problematic because services do not always have the adequate financial funds to do so. So, Pycroft teaches that rehabilitation centers are not prominent or not as prominent as they should be in countries because they lack the financial funding. Pycroft also created a list of things that he said are wrong with the mental health procedures in the criminal justice system. First, he said that some professionals working in statutory settings have not received robust training on how to identify people who have mental health necessities. However, these same professionals are responsible for conducting screening processes for mental health individuals. A police officer is a strong example of this. Now, what Pycroft is saying is that when a police officer or someone else who interacts with a person who has a mental health issue, when they see a sign of a person suffering from a mental health issue, if they're not trained to recognize that sign, they're going to arrest them and charge them as a sane individual with no mental health issues because they aren't trained to recognize what mental health issues look like. Now, Simpkins stated that mental health can occur to people at almost any age, including children. This is important because there is a correlation between juvenile delinquents and mental health. As I was stating earlier, it is very imperative that children who suffer from mental health illnesses get diagnosed as quickly as possible. So therefore, the percentage of them, not necessarily the percentage, but the probability of them creating a criminal record is going to be much lower down the line. All right, so when applying literature to the problem, some Americans do not believe in rehabilitation systems and therefore it is underfunded. Mental health illnesses get overlooked and untreated. And rehabilitation is often overcrowded because they are sparse. So here are some solutions that can be applied to solve some of these issues. Firstly, the government should fund rehabilitation centers similarly to how they fund public schools. This should take care of a lot of financial issues that rehabilitation centers suffer from today. Secondly, the salary of rehabilitation workers should also increase. This would create an incentive for people to want to work in these professions. And thirdly, people who arrest or interact with people who have mental health illness need to be trained to recognize what mental illness looks like. These professions can include teachers, police officers, and judges. These professions, they should have mandatory classes that teach signs of what mental health illness looks like in the forms of behavior. This way, when someone commits a mental health when they show signs of a mental health illness, it can be recognized and they can be placed in a rehabilitation center sooner rather than later. And this can help them cognitively and it can help them reinstate into society healthily. And fourthly, there should be more rehabilitation centers installed around the world. This is my reference list. If you want to cross-check anything that I've stated, you're curious where I got my information from. And yeah, thank you very much for your time.